Alright, so this video we're going to be taking a look at render passes and some of the things we can do with render passes inside of Nuke. So the first thing you'll notice is that all the footage is contained in an EXR file. Not because EXR files that are sort of saved this way are used that much in production. In my experience, no one really saves out EXR files with all the different layers saved into them. I just did it this way just for simplicity, just so that when I give out the footage, it's only one file. So if you go to your viewer, you can see the different layers that are embedded in the file. So we have our RGB, we have a depth pass, we have just the plain texture pass. So it's just flat lighting with no shading on it. And then we have two different lighting passes, one for the direct light on the diffuse, and another one with the indirect lighting that's on the diffuse. We also have some normals, and then we have the illumination only. So this is just the light, the direct light that's shining on the model, and then we have the indirect light that's shining on the model. We have some motion vectors, and we have the object coordinate space, the reflection data. So this is a lot of Fresnel on it, so it's dark when it's looking at us, but if you turn that up, you can sort of see that information is still there. And we have more normals, just with the bump included, and our specular pass, a subsurface scattering pass, some UV coordinates on the model. It's coordinates in world space, and under other, we just have some one channel footage. If you look at the red channel, it's just the ambient occlusion pass. And if you look at the green channel, you have the cast shadows. Just the way Modo saves out renders, things that have one channel kind of get thrown into this other category over here. So the way kind of, well, where to start. So if we want to combine these different passes, so we have like our beauty passes in the RGB A. That's basically all the stuff that takes up the visible shading. And then we have the data passes that aren't part of this. But if I wanted to recombine the shading passes in order to get this, and maybe if I wanted to manipulate it or change some things around on it, maybe I'll go through this. So the first thing I would do is apply a Unpromoted to the footage. And I'm going to say divide all the channels by the alpha channel. And you can see that along the edges here, before they looked very nice and anti-aliased, but now they're very harsh, and you can sort of see there's no aliasing happening here. Or there's no anti-aliasing. There is aliasing happening here. But no anti-aliasing is happening along the edges of where the alpha is. And if you're not familiar with this, I mean, hopefully most of you are familiar with this. But if you're not familiar with this and you look at this and you're wondering, why would I do this beforehand? Why would I, and this is going to propagate through all my different layers of footage here. So if I go through, you can see that all of them are going to have these harsh edges. And why would I do that? Well, the reason for that is if I don't do that, my edges are going to get messed up at the end. Let's say I'm going to shuffle out, let's say the texture pass, and I'll shuffle out, let's say one of the indirect illumination. Okay, so here's my indirect illumination pass over here. Here's my diffuse pass over here, and I'm going to get a merge node, take these two guys together, combine them. And if I want the shading to be applied to the texture, I would go and say multiply. And now I have the indirect light that's hitting the model. And the problem that I'm going to run into is if I look at these edges. So if you look at the original, I'm going to get really close here. Now this doesn't have, if this had more motion blur on it, these examples would be a bit more easy to see. But if we look at, I'm going to get real close here, and I'm going to look at, say, this little strip of color right here. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going to look at this little strip of color right here. And if I look over here, you know, there's that strip of color in the texture pass. And if I look over here, there's that strip of color in the lighting pass. And then they get multiplied together, and you can see that this strip of color gets quite dark. And what's happening is, if you look over here, this is, if I take a reading of the color, you can see that it's like it's a percentage. It's like a, you know, it's like 0.1, 0.1, 0.09. And if I look at this color over here, it's 0.03, 0.02, 0.02. And when it gets multiplied together, you know, it's going to get quite dark. It's going to get, you know, 0.002, you know, like the numbers get darker quite a bit. And that's all fine. But then when if I would want to combine and put this over top of the background, I need my alpha channel. And these passes, I don't think they have proper alpha channels in them. So I'm going to just get a copy node, and I'm going to copy the alpha. Oops. I'm going to copy the alpha from the original over here. So there's the alpha being copied in, and then I'm going to do a, or actually let's just merge this over top. I won't even do a pre-mult here. But if I bring in, say, a checkerboard, and get a merge, and merge this on top, then what you'll notice is right along here, that strip of color, it's going to get dark. And if I compare that to the original, if I go just here and go to the original footage, you can see that it's not dark. It's kind of like that skin tone. And if I go back over here, it's going to get dark. And the reason why it gets dark is because if I look at my color, you can see over here that, you know, this has gotten quite dark. It's almost at black. But then if I go and I bring in the original alpha channel, you can see the original alpha channel is fairly bright. And if I look over here, the color then that it's going to grab is going to be this kind of dark color. And that's not something that we want. We want this to be more of like that skin tone, but we can't grab it because, you know, it's gotten darker by this multiplication operation. So over here, if I do this, if I go and I say, well, unpremultiply that, then you can see that that edge that before was kind of like half dark and half skin tone, now it's 100% solid skin tone. And I can do whatever I want. I can color correct this, or I can change it. I can do whatever, any sort of color operation that I need to. And then at the end, I would just apply a premult. And the premult just multiplies the alpha by the RGB, and it'll bring it back to the way it was originally. So if I look over here, you can see there's the original. Over here, here's the premult. If I go back and forth, it'll look exactly the same. So before I do any sort of color operations, I'm going to unpremultiply the footage by the alpha channel, and then at the end I'm going to premult it, basically just, again, multiply it by I'll multiply the RGB by the alpha channel, and that'll bring it back to normal. That'll put it back, the edges to the way they were. Okay, so let me just delete this stuff over here. So once that's been unpremultiplied, then I could shuffle out, so use the shuffle node to isolate the color channels that I want to grab. So the way it kind of used to be done, the way that when I first started mixing all, and started playing around in the first kind of shots that I was working on, I would get a fairly standard set of passes. I would get maybe the texture pass. And here it's just called diffuse coefficient. That's what Modo named it automatically. So I'll just call this shuffle texture. And I would get maybe the lighting pass. So I would get over here, and I would get the direct lighting. Oops, and I'm gonna make sure that's from the illumination. So I would get something that looks like this. So this would be just the direct lighting information that was going on the character. And so I'll call this shuffle direct illumination. And then I'll get a merge, and then set this to multiply. And now this one bounce, this is basically just, this is one, like a light that has no bounce. And this is the way I used to get things a few years ago. There'd be very harsh, like there's no fill light inside here. So wherever there would be shadow, it would be like 0, 0, 0 if I take a reading over here. You can see that this is actually at 0. If I gain this up, there's actually no light that's hitting that. And that's because indirect illumination was something that was kind of hard to calculate. It would take a lot of time. So what I would get instead, I would get an ambient occlusion pass. So if I go to my other and just grab the ambient occlusion pass, and it's a little bit bright. I should have rendered this out maybe a little bit darker. So I'm just going to gamma that down, maybe just a little bit, just so that a bit more detail gets in there. And so what I would have to do is I would have to take maybe like the texture pass and take the ambient occlusion pass and multiply that together. And so I would get something like this, set it to multiply. And let me just check out, oh, it's the gamma, I think. Let's see. And I'm just going to pause the video here for a second. I'm just not sure where I'm getting this little halo. So if I look here, you can see that I'm getting some bad pixels when I rendered this out. Some of the pixels are crazy bright. If I just go over here, you can see some of these, or if I maybe gamma that down. For some reason, when I rendered this out of Modo, you can see that some of these pixels are like, 1,640. It's too bright. So I'm just going to drop a clamp so that they get clamped off at 1. And then now I'll have that gamma, get it a bit darker, and then multiply it down. So then I would get something that looks like this. So I'm getting the ambient occlusion. I'm getting this sort of indirect light that's kind of all over, but you don't really know what direction it's from. And then I would have my direct lighting over here, and then I would get a merge, and I could play around with how much, and usually it's the fill light that would come in. So I could play around a bit with how much fill light this guy was going to get. So maybe just like a little bit of fill light over here. And this would be my fake for the indirect lighting. So as an example, if the direct light, just so we can see it a little bit better, if the direct light was maybe this sort of red color, in my indirect lighting was a bit green, I could get something that looked like this, and then I would copy in my alpha channel and just grab that from over here. So here's my alpha, and then do a pre-mult, make the edges go back the way they were. And this is how a lot of the basis of my comps would sort of get started off with. I would be playing around with how much indirect and direct lighting that I would be getting. And that indirect light was a fake of ambient occlusion. It would be something like that. Usually it looked better because the model was done better than what I was able to do, but it would look something like that. And then, I would then add in the reflection and the specularity of it. So if I made another shuffle, and I would get a spec pass, so I'll call that spec, and if I get another one for reflections, and if I get another one for the subsurface, subsurface, and then these three would just get added on top. These were all just additive layers. I would maybe go over here, and this is gonna look very messy, but I'll clean it up in a minute. So now I have this, set that to plus, and plus, and plus. And so I would get now something that looks like that. Okay, so there's my there's my reflection, specularity, and my subsurface. And that's basically it. That's how a lot of my comps, at least at the beginning and when I'm first getting everything worked out, that's how a lot of them would look. And I can just sort of clean this up a little bit. Let me put this over here and put a few elbow joints in so that it's not all coming from this guy. Whatever. I usually spend more time to organize it, but you get something that looks like that. So, and this worked pretty well. But over time, what started to happen was that they were able to actually calculate the indirect the global illumination much better. And it didn't take quite so long, as computers get more powerful. So what that would give me now, same thing, same start, but instead of doing this fake over here, where I would get my texture pass and then I would get my indirect lighting kind of faked from ambient occlusion, I would actually just get the indirect lighting. So what it might look like is if I take over here, I would actually just get passes then that looked like something like this. So if I would get my indirect lighting, and this has the texture kind of baked into it already. Now this is the direct lighting, so again, if I look over here, there's no bounces on that. The places that are in shadow are still in shadow, but over here, it's basically the same thing that I had over here when I took the texture pass and the direct lighting and multiplied it together. It's basically the exact same thing over here. And then, so that's the direct. And then I would get another shuffle over here. And this one would be my indirect lighting. And then that would get added together. So the advantage of this is that it's actually calculated, properly. I can still play around with how much lighting is going to get affected by this, how much my indirect lighting is going to be applied. But the fact that it's being applied and sort of calculated inside the renderer, which would hopefully be more accurate than this kind of fake that I was doing with ambient occlusion, that works a lot nicer. And then basically it's all the exact same layers that I would have over here. So if I add it in, I'll just grab it from over here, just so that we're not duplicating the same work. So now I get this, and then I would copy in the alpha channel. And every facility is a bit different. They have their own different ways of doing things, and right now I'm being very, very messy and very sloppy with my node layout. They may have certain specific ways of, and it may actually even just be a template of what is supposed to be plugged into the shot. It may even be auto-generated from the renderer, so you wouldn't even have to worry about putting all this stuff together. You should still understand it, of course. But now I have, it basically has recreated my beauty pass, but now I could add in color corrects at different stages to change things around to make it fit into the background plate a little bit nicer. So that's kind of the overall thing of all the different color passes, of all the different things that actually contribute to the shading. But then we have other passes that don't directly contribute to the shading, but they can be very, very useful. So things like, oh, and also, what actually might be a better way than assembling it before we get into the data passes is if I start off here, let's say I needed to change the subsurface scattering pass. Let's say it's supposed to be more like an alien, I don't know, whatever the example is, but you had to change one of these passes. Well, instead of building everything from scratch, the beauty pass is pretty close. So what you could do is subtract. So I'm going to get a shuffle. And I'll take the layer that I want to remove. So if I go to, let's say, the subsurface, and I go in here, and I say minus, and just flip the inputs around. So now I've subtracted, I've pulled out all the subsurface scattering that's here. And then what I can do is apply, say, a color correct to the subsurface. And I'm just going to, let's make this, pull out the red so that it's like a green subsurface scattering, and then add it back. And I don't think I really have to even change it to plus, but there it is there. So now that subsurface is being added back, and then just apply, same thing, copy the alpha. And actually, I probably don't even have to copy the alpha if there's the original alpha there. Just make sure that nothing gets messed around with the alpha. What I could also do is turn off even the A layer. Oh no. What is it? Oh no, it's not going to work. Well, if I just look here and check, oh yeah, it is affecting it. But not very much. If I go here, then my edges go back the way they were. And so you can see this is a lot simpler and a little bit easier than having to recreate your tree like that. You get something that's a little bit cleaner. So so there's that. Now, what if we wanted to use some of these data passes? So we'll take a look at some of these. one of them is a UV pass. And the UV pass, if I look at this over here, this contains the color contains the coordinate of where that would be in UV space. So what this allows us to do is to basically retexture our CG. Now, realistically, is very few times I've had to do this, but there's something called the ST map. And let's say I bring in a checkerboard. And so that's going to be my source. And then over here, it wants to know where the UV channels are. So I'm going to plug that into the ST map, plug that in over here. And I'm going to say get the UV channels from the UV coordinates. And now, when I look at it over here, you can see that it took the checkerboard and it mapped that texture to where this guy is in UV space. So you can see that it's following the UV layout of our guy. And now I could do something like I could just recombine it with the other layers. So let's say we have this guy over here. I'm just gonna delete these guys. And then I'm going to, let's say, I'm gonna subtract. Let's get a shuffle. And let's go find the texture pass. And then I'm going to get a merge. And I'm going to set this to minus. And just invert that. Okay, so that leaves me, that has subtracted out the texture pass. And then I'm going to get rid of the subsurface. So we'll set that to minus. So subsurface is gone. That's leaving me just with some reflections, specularity, all that sort of thing. And then I'm going to take this ST map and I'm going to multiply it by the illumination. And so let's go to the direct illumination. And I'm going to multiply that. So now the lighting information is being transferred onto it over here. And then I could get the indirect lighting. So I'll just go over here and get the indirect lighting. So illumination indirect. And I'm going to get, sorry, this is getting messy, but I'm just going kind of as fast as I can. So multiply that. So there's the indirect lighting is going to be applied to this. And then I could take these guys and then they get added together. So there it is there. And then now I could add that over here to like the specular, the reflections, that sort of thing. Set that to plus. And actually that doesn't really, not sure the math is really working out the way that I would want it to. So let's get this over here. And I'm just going to grab my additive layers, maybe just the spec and the reflection. So there's the specular pass, and then there's the reflection pass. That's pretty subtle. But now you can see that I've retextured this guy. just with the UV pass. Now, what if I wanted to apply some motion blur to this guy? So I'm gonna just copy the alpha, and then I'm going to just get the original alpha from over here, and then I'll do a pre-mult like that. So that makes the edges go back really nice. And I saved out motion vectors. If I look over here, if I go to motion vectors, it looks similar to the UV pass, but it's actually, it contains information about the directionality of the image, what direction the pixels are going in. So what I can do with this, I'm just going to copy that information down over here, because I think I'm pretty sure I lost that information somewhere along the way. Well, let's see, oh no, it's still here. So there's the UV pass, or not UV pass, I want the motion vector pass. So there it is there. And now what I can do is I'm going to bring in the vector blur. And with vector blur, I'm going to say, we'll just grab the motion vectors from the motion vector output. And then I'm going to, let's crank it up a little bit higher. And when I turn it up now, you can see that motion blur is going to be applied to this and added to this. The weird thing sometimes that can happen is that like the edges, like the alpha doesn't really get taken into account. And if that happens with you, just turn on alpha. Make sure you select an alpha channel over here. And for some, this is my weakness in Nuke. I don't know why backward doesn't seem to work, but if I switch it to forward, now the edges along my motion blur work quite nice. And that also should motion blur the alpha channel as well. So now I can take this. Now, keep in mind, it's not totally accurate. Like, this guy is rotating around. This tends to work really good if there's a lot of X and Y motion. When things are kind of doing like things that involve Z and 3D, it doesn't work quite as nice. But you can see how fast this is and how fast this is able to calculate things, which is very, very cool. So we have that. Another thing that we can do is use the position to points. In position to points, the way this works is you plug in some color. So I could even, let's plug in this guy before the motion blur. And this is a 3D node. Oops, sorry, looking at the wrong thing. And you can tell it's a 3D node because it has like the rounded node to it. It's not like a sharped corner node. Like it's not a square. And if I pull this out, you can see that there it wants position information. And the position information is, if I shuffle out, it's world coordinates. So I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to grab out this world coordinate space. And then I'm going to plug that in. And then when I look, you can see that it creates a point cloud, and the point cloud is based on the position of where all these points are. And you can also plug in, there's other things you can plug in like normal information. I think this helps if you wanted to do relighting. For the most part, you only really need this stuff, and this gives you your point cloud. And as it goes frame by frame to frame, you can see I just put a bit of rotation on this guy. So on frame 1, he's looking straight ahead. By frame 48, it's turning off to the side. And this is not actual, like, the thing to keep in mind is that this isn't geometry. If I zoom in close enough, you can see that these are just points. It's a point cloud. And it can only show the information that was actually rendered. So it can only show the stuff from the camera view. Stuff over here, there's no pixels for it, so it can't recreate that information. But this is super helpful. I mean, To be honest, a lot of the time I would just get the geometry for the scene, and I would just import that into Nuke. But if the geometry is super, super heavy, then you could use this. And here the geometry is much, much lighter. It's just a point cloud, and so you could have super detailed geometry, and you could bring it in, and you would just use this for reference for where this would exist in the 3D space. So I think that's super cool. So here's the position that it's at. Here's what this one looks like, and so the points it's able to recreate are these points over here. Now, as far as I know, you can do things like if I go to Vertex Selection and select some of these points, then if I had to say like a card, then I could go over here and say, well, match to position, orientation, and size, and then it would snap to the orientation of where that point is in space. And so if I scaled this up, then it would be oriented properly. So that's kind of cool. You know, if you needed to put something onto a card and you needed it to be exactly on the geometry, then you could do something like that. So there's that. There's also, and I think if I go in here, yeah, well, surface normal, I can just go here and say we'll grab the shading normals. And I don't know if that really changes too much. Not that I've noticed. I don't know if this last one is really that needed. And really the only thing you can really change is the detail, so how many of them, how many points there are going to be. So you can have very few, or if I turn this up, you know, you can get more and more detail. And then there's the size of it. So you could have it so that there's not very many points, but then you scale them up so that they're bigger. Or you could have really small points and have like a ton of them. So you can sort of see they're a lot more fine. Something like that. And, you know, you could render this out in Nuke Scanline Renderer if you needed to. The other thing that Nuke has included is a relight. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it over here. So the relight node, what you do, and actually I am going to use the position to points just to help me visualize things. So there's my position to points over here. And over here, we have the relight node. So the first thing you need is the color. So that just gets plugged into, I'll plug it into this guy. And then it needs lights. So I'm going to create, let's say, a point light. Or just a light, sorry. And so there's my light, and I could move my light. And the nice thing is that because I'm using the position to points, I can sort of visualize in 3D space where this light would have to be in order to light this up. And then you also need to have, look at this, normals. If I pull this out, oh yeah, it also wants like a camera. So I'm just going to make a camera. I don't even know if this camera has to be accurate. I don't know if it needs to like, I think this could just be anywhere, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And you need a material. So Nuke doesn't have that many materials in it. It has just going to apply a Fong to that. And then you also need to say the normal vectors. So I'm going to grab the shading normals, and then the point position, I'll grab that in world coordinate space. And so now if I look at this, after all that, I get this. And so I can get my light, and now if I take my light, maybe I'll split this view like this. And over here, I'm just going to make a new view. And the new view is going to look at my position to points over here. So now I can take this light, and if I change sort of the direction of the light, or the orientation of it, where it is, then that's going to update over here in Nuke. And then after the relight, you can see my edges are anti-alias. I'm not anti-alias properly, so I just need to do a pre-mult. And do I have an alpha? I do. So now when I look at it, the edges should get nice, or nicer than what they were. Now, there are some issues with this, some very, very big issues with this. The biggest issue is there are no cast shadows. It doesn't cast shadows properly. So if you look over here at the nostril, even though the light is shining way up in the air over here, you would expect that to be casting a shadow inside the nostril, but there is no nostril, or no shadow from the nostril being created. So yeah. So I know this was long, but hopefully you got something kind of cool out of it. So yeah. So I think that's it for this video. It looks like my computer is about to crash. I got the beach ball of death. So I'm going to stop this now. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.